You know, one of the surest ways that I know of harvesting a white-tailed deer with a bow and arrow is from a standing cornfield. You know, for the last 30 years as a bow hunter, if I've heard other bow hunters say it once, I've heard them say it 1,000 times. They'll say, you know, I'm not seeing many deer out in the woods, but all the corn is in yet. And the deer are out in the cornfields. As soon as the corn gets harvested, then they'll move into my woods where I can get them. And well, I'll tell you something. You know, you don't have to wait for those deer to come out of the corn into your woods in order for you to hunt them. It's a simple matter of learning how to go out in a standing cornfield and go in and harvest a deer right in the standing corn. And that's what this video today is about. If you want to be successful at hunting deer in a standing cornfield, one of the first things that you should understand is simply why the deer are in the cornfield. You know, it's quite obvious that deer are in the corn because there's a lot of food and there's a lot of cover in a cornfield, but the main reason they're in a cornfield is for reasons of security. Now I'll explain that this way. If you take a section of woods that deer frequent, a section of woods that deer like to live in and bed in and so on and so forth, you have to realize that the woods receive a lot of attention. They receive attention from hunters. You've got bow hunters pre-season in their scouting. You've got bow hunters during the season. Farmers graze the woods with livestock. There's nature lovers in the woods. There's coon hunters day and night in the woods. The woods receive a lot of attention. And what happens a lot of times in the woods, be it a bow hunter, he's out scouting for sign, looking for deer sign, looking for a place to put up his stand. A lot of times they'll blunder into where a deer beds and jump the deer up. And I'll tell you what, you know, you can jump up a good whitetail buck once, maybe twice, and get by with it. But you go bothering him too much or jumping him up the third time, he says, you know, that's enough of this. And he moves out and he looks for a place where he can go lay down and bed down and be by himself and not be bothered. You know, the one thing about a whitetail buck is this, you know, he can live with man and he can live very close to man. And he doesn't mind that as long as man doesn't know he's there. I know whitetail bucks that'll bed down 100 feet from a farmer's house back in their grove or in the edge of a cornfield near right where the guy lives. And as long as the farmer doesn't know that that deer's there and the deer feels comfortable about it, he can be and remain very close to man. But the main thing a deer does, whenever he has to bed, he wants to bed in a place where he's not bothered. And I'll tell you what, when he gets bothered in the woods, they just pick up and they move out into these standing cornfields. Now, when you consider that when this corn, after it gets this high, the farmer cultivates it for the last time with his tractor, you know, never again does man step foot in that cornfield until it's time to be harvested. People aren't going through this field. Hunters aren't going through the field. The only thing the deer sees in this field are other deer and other wildlife. And he becomes very comfortable because he can go into this cornfield, he can lay down undisturbed all day long. He becomes very relaxed with his bedroom. But I'll tell you what, when that happens, the deer becomes very vulnerable to the bow hunter simply because he is so relaxed in his environment and he's so used to not being bothered that a bow hunter, if he knows what he's doing, he can go in there and he can get to very close ranges and harvest these deer in these standing cornfields. Confidence is very, very important. If you just come up to a cornfield and you think, my gosh, there's a deer in there, how am I ever going to find it? I'm not going to be able to find this deer. You're not going to find him. And but if you have confidence that you can actually go into that field, and later on in this video we're going to show you some diagrams of how to work a field in a grid system, in a search pattern, that's going to make it possible for you to locate those deer in a field and actually locate every deer that's in that field. And then we're going to show you some stalking techniques, and that'll get you right up on top of that deer. And but confidence is very, very important to have. Now, to help build your confidence level a little bit, I want to tell you a story, a true story that happened a few years ago. Involves my two sons, John and Elliot, and a good friend of mine by the name of Barry Day. And I'm going to tell you a deer hunting story, actual story, to help build your confidence level so that you can realize how good this cornfield hunting can be. Now, Barry Day is a good friend of mine, and Barry quite a cornfield hunter. In fact, it's the only way that Barry Day ever hunts deer with a bow and arrow, and that's in a standing cornfield. Well, I'll tell you what, you know, Barry was a block layer, a cement contractor, always busy working in the fall, and the only times that he could hunt was when it rained or snowed or was extremely windy, bad weather conditions. Well, then Barry would grab his bow and he'd head out into a standing cornfield and go deer hunting on these type of days. And I'll tell you what, Barry has got so good at hunting deer in a standing cornfield that the first year that Barry went out into a standing cornfield, he shot a whitetail buck during the first hour of that first year in the standing corn. To make a long story short, Barry went out the second year, the third year, and the fourth year. He went 4 years in a row, and during the first hour of the first day of each of those years, Barry was able to harvest a whitetail buck out of a standing cornfield. 4 years, 4 hours, 4 bucks. The fifth year and the sixth year, Barry also killed a whitetail buck on the first day of the year that he went out into a standing cornfield. The only difference was it took him longer than an hour on each of those 2 days. But the thing of it is this. I don't know of any other type of bow hunting that's as productive as cornfield hunting. You might be able to go out in your woods, get up in your tree stand, and the first time you're up in the stand during that first hour, a whitetail buck comes walking by, you put an arrow through him and you take this buck. And there's even the possibility that you could do that the second year, but I'll tell you what, it's not going to happen the third year, the fourth year, the fifth and sixth year. It just isn't going to happen. Hunting deer in a standing cornfield is so productive, and such a good way to harvest a whitetail that if you haven't been doing it, you got to learn how to do it and get in these fields and hunt them. You know, I'm very fortunate. I live 8 miles from Minnesota. I live 40 miles from South Dakota, and as a result, I get a non-resident Minnesota license. I've got an Iowa license. I've got a Dakota license, and my sons and Barry, we all do that, get all these licenses, and then we hunt the line up here. We'll hunt Minnesota one day, Iowa the next day, or even jump back and forth during the same day. But a few years ago, we had a very wet fall. Farmers had a hard time getting their corn out, and there was a lot of snow, and most of the corn was out, and we were down to just a few cornfields, and the deer were really packed into these remaining fields, and the weather conditions were perfect. We had snow on the ground. We were dressed in white camo. We even put white masking tape on our bows. I even go so far I put white fletched arrows on. And I'll tell you what, it was windy and blowing and snowing, and those deer were bedded down deep in those cornfields. And we went up on the Iowa-Minnesota line, and we got out there in the mid-morning, and my son John killed a buck up on the Minnesota side during the first hour. Barry killed a buck on the Iowa side, and I killed a buck on the Minnesota side. And so we had 3 whitetail bucks in a matter of 3 or 4 hours of hunting. We brought these deer back into town. We went back out the next day, and I harvested a 10-pointer. My son John got a 10-pointer in Iowa. My son Elliot got a buck. We hunted just a very few hours, and we had 6 whitetail bucks taken with a bow and arrow, all out of standing cornfields. And it's just a very, very productive way to take a whitetail buck. And I've always had a saying that here in the Midwest where I live, that if the field conditions are right, I can leave my house, and within an hour of leaving my house, I can have some venison strung up on a meat pole someplace if I'm not too fussy at what I want to shoot. So, like I say, this is a confidence level builder for you, and if you've got the confidence, I'm telling you, you can do it. You know, there's certain field conditions that have to exist that will allow a bow hunter to get very close to bedded deer in a standing cornfield. You have to take into consideration, you know, early in the bow season, when the bow season first opens, these corn stalks aren't mature yet. They're green. Weeds and grasses are standing and they're green. And visibility down the rows, down the corn rows, is not very good because all the leaves are hanging in there, you know, and the weeds and grasses are standing up. And it's not impossible to go into a standing cornfield at that time of the year and find and harvest a deer out of there, but it's a lot harder then than it is, for instance, now. As the bow season progresses and we get some colder weather, the corn matures, turns brown, dries out, weeds and grasses drop down, visibility down the rows widens out, picks up, and you can actually see down these rows quite a ways. And then things are starting to look up for the bow hunter the later into the bow season it gets in these standing cornfields. And then you have to take into consideration that as the farmers start to harvest these fields, they pick one field, the deer will move out of that pick field into the next standing field, and the more corn that comes out, the more concentrated the deer become in the remaining fields. So the thing you want to keep in mind is that the middle of the bow season to the end of bow season is going to be your best time to find and harvest a deer out of a standing cornfield. But regardless of the time of the year, there's several things that must exist weather-wise to make it possible for you to get close to these deer. Now, those conditions are this time of the year, this corn is, you can hear it's dry, it's brittle, and I'll tell you what, when the wind blows and you get a good strong wind in this stuff and this corn rustles, these dry husks are rattling together, these cornfields get so noisy you can't hardly hear yourself think inside that cornfield. A bow hunter can slip through this field and do it quite fast on a windy day and not make a noise. And the deer are so used to all this noise around them, as long as a bow hunter just isn't running into things, if he's just kind of sneaking his way through there, you'd be amazed at how close you can get to a deer on a windy day when this stuff is, when it's warm weather, dry, and this mature corn is blowing. Another condition that can exist and make it very good is rain. Whenever it rains, this stuff gets wet. It gets just like a dish rag. And when it gets wet, it becomes very quiet. You can brush up against it. You can squeeze your way right through that wet stuff and not make a sound. One of my favorite times to hunt a cornfield is during a rain. I don't know why it is, but deer become very placid in the rain. They become very relaxed. They'll lay there and the rain will be raining and the corn stalks are just wet. You can move through there slow. Ground footing is soft and not crunchy. And I don't know why it is, but in the rain you can get extremely, extremely close to a bedded deer in a standing cornfield. What I do is put on a light rain suit and then put this camel over the rain suit. It helps muffle the noisy rain suit, plus it keeps me dry to a certain extent. And the next field condition that's good for sneaking deer in a cornfield is the late season hunting is when you get snow. And when you get snow in a standing cornfield and you've got wind to go with it, I'm telling you what, you've got the perfect situation. Visibility down the corn rows picks up greatly. I mean, you can see a deer 100 yards down these corn rows if you have snow. And if you put on weight clothing, white fletched arrows, put some white masking tape on the face of your bow. You're almost invisible in there to a deer. Snow on the ground muffles your foot noise. Just everything is better if you have snow in a standing cornfield. But like I say, the conditions that must exist are wet, snow, or dry. But regardless if it's wet, snow, or dry, you have to have wind. The wind is the key factor. If it's windy and blowing hard, you can be successful at getting very close to deer in a standing cornfield. Okay, I want to talk to you just a little bit about equipment. There are a couple of things you ought to know about equipment when it comes to sneaking up on deer in a cornfield. And the first thing I want to talk to you about is a bow. Now, it doesn't make any difference what kind of a bow you shoot. If you shoot a recurve bow, or if you shoot a compound like this one. This particular bow is a Cascade recurve. I've shot a lot of animals with it. Very, very effective bow. Recently, I've been shooting this Legend XI bow compound. Very effective bow. They both work very, very well. The only thing I want to say about bows is use what works for you the best, and use to the best of ability the bow that you choose to hunt with. And like I say, in the corn, it doesn't matter if you use a recurve or if you use a compound. Either one works very, very well. But there are a couple of things that you can do to your bow and do to your equipment to